Hey folks, Steve here with another Korea Fire and Ice video. We're going to be getting into a whole new phase of the game in this video because we are reaching Chinese intervention. Now, this will occur here during the foreign intervention phase of the January 1951 uh, monthly turn, but this was as late as it could happen. So we hit the default intervention time period. They did not come in during any other die roll. There was a few turns there, or a few monthly turns, where the Chinese could have intervened, but the die rolls were such that they did not. So here the game sort of forces the situation. We are going to get the Chinese to intervene. That's what's going to happen. So I've already rolled for the weather. It is clear again, but again, still a winter turn, which will tend to hurt the UN. And the other thing that will be important as I go through this turn is that all of the UN units and HQs will be turned to their spent side when we get to the communist activation phase, because of the Chinese intervention, we are effectively having a surprise attack, which will mean that once again the communists will get the ability to draw 3 chits and pick which one they want to use during the turn of surprise, which would just be this turn, the first half of January 1951. We are having 2 turns for the month, weeks 1 and 2 as a turn, and weeks 3 and 4 as a turn. So we have a whole bunch of Chinese units to add to the map. And how we do that is actually kind of interesting. And if I read the rules right, this happens immediately. So as we go to the foreign intervention, before we do foreign aid, I believe this Chinese intervention automatically triggers here without a die roll. We are not in the conditions for Soviet intervention, so there is no other foreign intervention for the communists. It is simply Chinese intervention. And really, what you need to refer to, and I had it off on another table, I had to go grab it. At the end of the reinforcement schedule, you can see after July 1951, there's this after Chinese intervention. So this is the list of stuff that will come onto the board. And it's going to take, I'll do this off camera because it's going to take some time to fiddle through everything. But basically, we get a theater commander for the communists. We get Peng Duhai. I'm sure I cannot pronounce that correctly. I apologize. But the communists get their commander. We'll look at what he can do shortly. Then we have 3 different waves of Chinese communists. So wave 1, we get a certain allotment of units and some HQ action. They are placed on their fresh sides. And as you can see, we're going to have them placed at any communist supply source space, and then move 15 movement points, which means we could put them all at one supply source space and then move them. I could spread them out, I believe. I think I'm allowed to do that. Though based on the current board position, we'll probably have certain areas of focus. They will get to move 15 movement points, which is quite a lot. And really, if we look at the position of the game map, I mean, that's more than enough to get to the UN lines, I believe. So then we have the second wave, which is a whole other set of units. They get to move 10 movement points. Again, probably more than enough to get to where they probably need to be. And then the third wave is just 5 movement points. But again, if you're moving along the roads, that's actually pretty far. So we're going to have a whole mass of these units kind of all pile in. And I'll have to really think through, okay, where do I want these guys to end up? And that's before they even will get to activate for regular activations. Then we get a few additional aircraft, so 3 additional aircrafts. We get an extra improved airfield. So that is what we get. Now, that is wholly separate from any foreign aid, which would go to the artillery and tank tracks. Now, the communists can still separately ask for foreign aid, but they would give the UN player yet another victory point. And the thing is, The uh, the UN player is currently at 13 victory points, which is they are humming along towards automatic victory. So I think what's going to happen here is the communists are going to get the Chinese set up. There's enough support elsewhere that they'll probably be okay without foreign aid, and they will not ask for foreign aid. They will not increase the UN VP marker anymore. And I think that's sort of the natural. I think I see this as a good thing in the game. I know folks are watching and kind of wondering like how foreign aid and the victory points all work together and how much foreign aid is realistic. I mean, I think there's a point where you don't like you're not going to always ask for foreign aid because that foreign aid may not be enough to make a difference to make up for the fact that you just pushed your opponent maybe even closer to victory. And if they're in this position like I'm in now where the UN has a bunch of victory points on the board that it's like a ticking time bomb for victory. They just have to survive so many turns to pick those victory points off the table and they win the game that like right now I don't want to ask for any more foreign aid. It is probably endangering me more if I do that. So I'm not going to. And I'm going to hope that the Chinese streaming over the border will be enough to support the communist cause. And of course, now, the communists will be doing everything they can to pick up their own victory points to not only offset the victory points that the UN player will be trying to achieve, but to try to pull that victory marker over to the red side over the next, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 16 more turns. There's still, I think, six, like this turn inclusive, 16 turns left in the game. That's still a decent amount of time to be trying to pull that victory point marker back into the red, which is where they want to be for victory by the end of the game. Probably, almost certainly unlikely the communists would somehow pull this all the way back to 21 victory points in the red, but they want to get over the hump and get back into the red zone. Now, the one tricky bit of this, as I'm talking about it, is as soon as the red player gets some victory points, and I'll have to double check the rules and the logic. We are facing the possibility that MacArthur, commander, is replaced by Ridgway, and he seems to be much better for the UN player. The things, his abilities, and what they allow the UN player to do is really strong. And I think no matter how good the communists are going to play, once he comes onto the board for the UN, the UN's still going to have a lot of advantages. And if I were to just make a bet right now, as of Chinese intervention, I think the UN will win this game. I think the UN is positioned. They have enough of a cushion. They can still get more. They're going to have some increase in capability shortly that they'll probably win. But if in this surprise round, the Chinese like obliterate a bunch of UN forces, then maybe it'll be different, right? If the UN has to dig into its victory point total to offset combat losses, that will be a great help to the communists. And that might be where the UN player has to decide, do they give up victory points or do they give up units or retreat or make them weaker to try to hold on long enough to get the victory points they need for victory, right? That's really going to be some of the tricky bits here to figure out for them, for sure. So yeah, there you go, guys. I think we're good from there. I just want to double check a couple other things. Yeah, I think we're good. Okay, I'm going to go get the Chinese communists set up for their intervention actions and get those reinforcements added where they need to go. So I'll be back. Okay, so quickly, I just want to show what the Chinese intervention forces look like stacked up. So we have 14 combat units in an HQ. Second wave is 12 combat units in an HQ, and the final is just 3 combat units and an HQ. So that last third wave is going to be kind of bringing up the rear with just a handful of units, but I mean we're going to have plenty of HQs on the board, I think, to operate this, and I think we'll be in pretty good shape for the most part. But again, we get so many movement points to come onto the board with that we really shouldn't have any issues getting to somewhere we want to be on the board. So I will get this set up here in just a second. I just wanted to show it's a fair amount of units, and when you spread it out like this, just to kind of show what this ends up looking like. You can start to see just how significant this is going to be. I mean, that's a fair amount of units, right? Um, that's a fair number of units, and that's okay. But once we get this applied to the board, now it would be a lot nicer if there were some North Koreans left to support here. And I might even find that like this number of Chinese units doesn't get me truly as far as I would like to be, but um, I think that surprise action is going to be what's really important to ensure that we really hit these UN forces as hard as we can in the early phase here, so that maybe the same thing happened with the UN against the North Koreans. If we can manage to eliminate any or some of the UN forces, that will be less to defend, less to defend, less to defend over time as we can chew them up. But the difference is that where the North Korean forces, or even the South Korean forces at the very beginning of the game, were more scattered and a lot more space between these units, the UN forces that I've set up here have tried to create something resembling um, a front line. And I maybe got a little you know, over trigger happy here, and I left a gap, and that could come back to bite them, depending on how much movement we really have to work with. So it'll be interesting to see how I'm able to set these guys up, and I have to kind of figure out, what supply sources make sense. Like this supply source kind of has a dead end, so it's really hard to get them navigated. It might be better to have units come in up here and come down this coast road to get down here, and then otherwise, most of the units will be coming through, I think, these supply hexes here as we get going. So I'll try to figure out what makes the most sense, and maybe what I should do is if I count, and I'll do all of this off camera so you guys aren't bored watching me count hexes and road hexes and stuff. It might make sense that the first wave comes in up here and uses all that 15 movement points to get down and around this area, and then the third wave just pops across the border down here, where gosh, it only takes 1, 2, 3, 3 to 5 movement points to get to the front line here. That third wave can more easily can get to where they would want to be for that. So yeah, I think in general the units are going to be able to get to wherever they want to go, because they're going to use the road and rails, and it just becomes less of an issue there. But okay, I've already brought the extra air units on. I'll just speak to that very quickly. The Chinese have brought in a I'm not sure how to say this appropriately because I can't remember the full name of the plane. It's a TU-2, a 2-2. um, that is a strategic bomber. I very much doubt the communists will ever get that into the air and used, just because of the air superiority of the UN. Again, I think somebody else who was looking at this game complained that the communists have strategic air assets. Well, yeah, they do. They own planes. Whether or not they will ever get to use them, I think, is the real problem. They'll never get past the Allied air advantage, I think, at all. We did get some more MiGs, and one of the less good older MiGs. I suspect that won't be enough to truly contest the UN forces, but we might try and just see what happens. Of course, we do have winter weather, which is its own problem. So I don't know how this is all going to pan out. But there you go, guys. I did put Pang in his commander box, but we'll look at that in the activity phase for what all bonuses he actually provides there. So okay, I'm going to stop yapping. I'm going to get these units set up. We'll take a look at what things appear to be once we're done. Okay, so here we are after the Chinese crossing over the border and into place. And so A couple of things I need to point out. Because you can stack units if they are unspent. I currently have a couple of hexes that have several Chinese divisions set up together. So way out here, some over here, and a few in a couple other spots. Um, that is because, like, when you use 15 movement points to get all the way down here, and I needed to get somebody to the eastern flank of these U.S. divisions. I didn't want to leave them all behind one another, but they are allowed to stack, so they're all stacked up right up there at the very corner of your screen. But when the communists actually activate to do stuff, they will then disperse and get set up for attacks. So it is, in some ways, I needed to approach some of these areas the right way with what movement allowance I could get. And for the most part, you can see, I mean, it just ended up working out pretty well that I could get guys more or less where I wanted them to be. Now, the one interesting thing is when you spend these movement points to bring the Chinese units on, they say they stay unspent, right? They stay fresh. And it doesn't appear to have any restriction on units entering Zox. I if there's a restriction there, I haven't seen it or I didn't look hard enough. Could be I didn't look hard enough. But it did not seem like there was any issue with it entering Zox with this movement, as long as you could pay for the Zox, which the Zox are not gone yet. The Zox will be gone during the surprise, which doesn't even happen until the communist activation. So, in several places, because the supply hex they came from was not very far away, a number of units are smack dab next to several UN forces. This will enable them to do some deliberate attacks when the time comes, and those deliberate attacks are going to be fairly potent in providing bonuses for adjacent units and the whole thing. Now, it's going to be interesting to see kind of how this pans out, because now that we're sort of all spread out, it's not as bad as I thought maybe it could be. Certainly, there's a lot more communist forces on the board, period, and there's obviously less North Korean units in general. But I mean, we're kind of in okay shape. The one thing that I'll need to keep in mind is that Chinese HQs, which I have here, over here, and over there, Chinese HQs can activate any communist unit, whether they're North Korean or Chinese or whatever. But North Korean HQs can only activate North Korean units. With our new communist commander, this is going to be one of the special abilities of our good buddy here. He basically allows us to activate more units than we could activate before. So let me just pull up the rules so you guys can kind of see. For some reason, the PDF is in a weird resolution, and this did not print well. I guess this far away it reads fine. So communists may activate 6 units with each HQ rather than 4. And then during winter months, and there's only 3 more turns of winter months, we get to draw 3 combat chits. So we're going to get this for our surprise turn, but then for the next 2 turns after that, we will get this benefit because, again, the UN forces just did not have a good time with the winter weather when this 1950 to 1951 winter season. So Peng provides a lot of benefits to the communist forces right now, and they're really going to need it because when you understand how many units we're actually going to be looking to activate, I mean 6 at a time. So you figure this one HQ alone can activate. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's 3 in this hexa 1. So that'd be 1 activation. Then we'd have to refresh him, and then he could activate these sort of other 5 or 6 in range. And then we'd have to refresh him again to activate some of these guys or use this HQ, but he's got the same problem. So while activating 6 more units activating 6 units instead of 4 is a great advantage. They are going to need it because I just have so many units. And while we weren't really too worried about spending supply in the past with units, um, obviously spending supply to reactivate HQs wasn't a big deal before because we weren't activating much at all. We are now going to have to keep an eye on the communist supply because they will need to, now from here on through the rest of the game, they're going to need to, figure out where it makes sense to attack and to push and to focus moving forward, which will be interesting. I can definitely see why, if you're looking at this game and you go look at scenario 3, which is the Chinese intervention scenario, why that might be a really obvious scenario to just go and play instead of the full campaign. Because all of this crazy stuff with, like, yeah, the North Koreans beat up on the South Koreans, the UN forces will come in and the US will beat up on the North Koreans. And it's only really when the Chinese enter are the two sides, reaching a bit of equilibrium where they can both punch and counterpunch and do the whole thing. And the game state in the late phase might be, impacted by how well you do beating up on your opponent when they're at their worst, right? So, like, the UN has really beat up on the North Koreans when they were at their worst, maybe more so than we might have thought otherwise, or what might be the average result. That's going to color the later parts of this game, right? The UN might be at a greater advantage than average, and that will help them. But if you wanted to kind of skip past all those big swings, then I can definitely see, yeah, you would start playing scenario 3, which is still like the scenario 3 starts like over here. That's still like like you still have most of the game to go at that point, and you're sort of skipping to the big show, I guess, or the really, the where the sides are a better match for one another through the turns of the game. Um, so this is something, an observation, I guess, that, you know, I guess this goes for any Korean War game, but that, I don't know, just something I'm looking at, right? It's, yeah, you would similarly look at doing the same type of thing, and it would be interesting to see how the Chinese intervention scenario setup differs from, what we're seeing here. I believe as a part of that, the Chinese units still have to move 15 movement points, 10 movement points, 5 movement points. So there's no setup for the Chinese. You sort of put them where you want. But I think the UN has a relatively static setup. So I don't know, it might be fun to compare. Um, but there you go. So we have moved those guys in, and now we can get through the rest of the monthly turn. I realize this is a lot of stuff going on, but this was pretty important. I will say again that we're not going to do 4 and 8 as the communist side. We can't afford to give up any more victory points. The supply and infrastructure stuff is going to be pretty straightforward, I think. The only thing I think that might really matter is what is the UN player going to do with their supply, because once we hit the surprise action, all their stuff is going to be spent, and they're not going to be able to refresh anything even on their turn, because you only refresh an HQ at the end of an HQ intervention, right? We covered this way back when the other sides, the previous times we were having a surprise action, they're basically out for the whole turn until the beginning of the next turn, when you can potentially be refreshed. So during this turn, not so good. So the UN player has to keep some supply for the second turn of this month, but he could maybe afford to spend a little bit of supply trying to add some more prepared position markers somewhere. I'm not sure that's a valuable use of their supply or not, but it's certainly an option. So I'm going to need to decide what all they're going to do with spending to refresh stuff. But otherwise, we'll handle the aircraft recovery and reinforcement phase, which will be relatively straightforward. And we'll just get to the air commitment phase when we come back. Okay, so here we are with the communist air display. We haven't looked at this in a while, but thanks to both the intervention reinforcements, but now also the regular turn-based reinforcements, the communists do actually have something of a air force to use. They still have a few units that are in their damaged aircraft. I have not been able to get them out of there yet. The die rolls just are not coming up well for the communists, but that's to be expected. They have to roll a 3 or less, which is much worse than the UN capability. Now you can see over here, I sort of have them grouped. Fighter types are in the top row, strategic bombers on the right side, and tactical bombers on the left side of the second row each. Here's the thing. So the communist player has to decide first if they're going to commit their air and what they're going to commit. This always gives an advantage to the UN player, rightly so, because they can say, okay, well, if the Russians, if the communists are willing to put guys in, say, MiG Alley or strategic bombing, then the UN player can decide, are they going to contest that? They probably will. And if the communist doesn't try to put units in MiG Alley or whatever, then the UN can say, okay, well, then I'm not going to bother either. I'm going to send all my stuff on tactical missions. So the communist has to keep that in mind. Like whatever they decide to do, the UN will be able to counter to whatever sufficient, degree they really want to. Um, Here's the thing: we are still in winter, which means we have a -2 to the ability rating of any given aircraft, no matter what, even for the communists. Um, the problem with that is many of the planes on the communist side aren't very good once we start taking, two off. So these strategic bombers, for instance, of which we have two, have a bombing rating or ability rating of a 3. Well, if you take two off of that, it's a 1, which is pretty risky. Now, we could do that with the UN with less of a problem because even if we had a damaged aircraft, we have a pretty good odds chance of getting it repaired. If we tried to send these bombers out and need a 1 to be rolled to hit anything, um, that's probably too much risk because if they do become damaged, it could be a long time, maybe never, before those units are back into service. Now, if you look at like an IL-10, well, its value is 2. 2 minus 2 is 0, so they can't even really do anything. Um, and even for tactical missions, our 2 IL-10s don't give us a whole lot, not enough for it to matter. So 2 minus 4 is 2. 2 of those planes equals 4 altogether. Most of the time, the support penalties will range from 2 to 3. So 2 to 3 minus 4 is like a 1. So at best, it's going to give us a 1 die roll modifier. So again, in the winter, while you can use air, it's just not as good. It might not even be valuable to try. So right now, it's like, well, is there anything I can really do? Sending the bombers out, probably not a great idea. If we send out our fighters, we could send them out to MiG Alley and say, hey guys, let's have ourselves a duel. What does that really look like? Um, well, we only have, let's see, our LA9, Law 9. I'm not sure how that's going to be pronounced, the full word, so I'm not going to try. Its value is 1. No reason to fly that guy. 0. A MiG-9 has a value of 3, minus 2 is 1. Probably not worth it. Then we have our MiG-15s, of which we have two now. 3 someday if we can repair this poor guy. So they would have a 2 value. We could essentially, if we send anything, it would be worth sending 2 planes with a value of 2 against the allies who probably are going to be able to do much better. But I think the tricky bit is because we're trying to roll so much lower than our standard capability, it does call into question, like, why do we bother to risk it right now? I mean, what the communists would need to be able to do from a strategic air perspective is to do very well with their MiGs and hit, get lucky and hit enough times to chip away at the UN air advantage to such a degree that they can gain air superiority. Very unlikely. Now, what they might hope for is maybe some MiG Alley victory points, but to do that, you have to clear your opponent from the box, and at best, we're only going to get 2 hits. The UN player can send oodles and noodles of planes to MiG Alley and outlast us. So right now, is there anything for us to do right now? If we do top cover, the same issue is going to apply. If we send our MiGs to top cover, there will be a top cover battle this monthly phase, and the same type of thing is going to apply. The UN will very likely overcome what's going on. So what I might do this turn is simply not send any of our planes up. Just don't send up any. And that sucks because this is such an important set of turns for the communists to make some headway. But the weather is bad enough that it just puts too much risk for the communist air force. So I'm showing this so you guys can see that yes, they do have some assets here, but at least for the next couple of turns, there's just not much value in trying to send them up into the skies. Worst case scenario, they get shut up and they're lost. Best case scenario, we get really lucky. I'd rather try it when the weather is better and at least we have better odds of hitting something with what little capability we actually have. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll have in a few more scheduled reinforcement phases some more withdrawals on the part of the UN. I haven't looked ahead at that. I don't know. That's maybe I should. But we'll leave it go. But I want to make sure you guys can see kind of the disparity. There's I think in the old Victory Games Korean War game, like they don't even give the communists any air units because they just like it's just a lost cause kind of thing. They give the UN player air assets to use to a certain degree, but they don't bother giving the communists any. And even looking at this situation where the game has a pretty good and interesting air model that I think it is similar to many other air models in game series like Next War and Frank Chadwick's Third World War. I think has a somewhat similar system. Like it's cool, and you can say, yeah, here the communists have planes. They do have planes. Will they ever actually fly and do damage? Unlikely, but possible. Unlikely, but possible. Okay, so we'll go ahead and switch it over to the UN air display, and they're going to do their strategic bombing stuff very likely at this point. Okay, as one would imagine, there's not as much here for the UN to really decide. In fact, I've just not taken these guys off these boxes, because they're fine where they're at. Like this is perfect. This is how I want to use them. This is working out for us. I'm happy to keep it at this setup for the time being. But we do have strategic missions like so. We've got a couple of B-29s that have been damaged. I haven't gotten them out of the box yet. I rolled poorly for repairs, but for these guys, we are going to try to hit communist infrastructure. So just very quickly, we'll get a couple of rolls out of the way. First one, we're going to need a 2 or less due to the weather, and that's a fail. And the second one, we got a hit. Okay, I will mark that for the infrastructure going down by 1. With the communists less likely to do foreign aid, this will start to hurt now because they're going to get less infrastructure repair over time. I do want to try to hit some airfields. Now I need a roll of 1 each time to do it, so unlikely, but we'll see. Oh, we got one. Cool. So that is a airfield in China that is damaged, and we'll do the other one. Not enough. So he goes to that, and that's it. So I just need to move 1 Chinese airfield to damaged. That is important because if we can do a few more of those hits, it's going to cost the Chinese player the ability to fly planes at any point that they'll want to in the future, and to repair those airfields, that will cost them supply which they will then not be using elsewhere in the game. So that UN air advantage, it is here. It's interesting to see the system play out, but yeah, you're going to see the UN, stomp all over the communists. That's just going to be what happens, right? It's historical. I could see where the air system in other games in the series might be a lot more interesting. I'm not sure how the Vietnam one's going to go, but I know the latest game, which covers a Third World War in Germany kind of scenario, you kind of are likely to have more symmetrical forces. So the air war in that game is probably a lot more interesting, and because it forces that are similar to one another fighting, a little less expected as to how that's going to shake out, right? Okay, well, with that done, we can start looking at the first turn. I do not think, well, let's see. Um, I don't think we're going to move the fleet. We're going to leave them in the Sea of Japan box because I want their support to be available up here on this flank for now. It's a tough decision, but amphibious invasion, no. Sea evacuation, no. Reinforcement phase. So we'll take a look at the reinforcements. I'll get those guys set up. Here's the thing. The UN communication and refresh phase would be next. I'm not going to bother because everyone's going to get flipped to their spent side when we get to the communist activation phase due to supply. So let me take care of that stuff and we'll come back. Okay, one thing I should point out, there wasn't much North Korean strategic movement to do. Largely had to do with moving uh, guys, adjusting around here a little bit. Um, but we are at the communist activation phase, and just want to remind what surprise does. So all the units of the opposing side, in this case the UN player, all of their units, all of their HQs are flipped to spent. Again, this means those HQs are not going to be reverted back until the next month, which means that basically the UN player for the next two turns, this turn and next turn, cannot activate anybody at all for any reason. The advantage, not advantage, but it gets a little bit better next turn because the UN player will get a refresh phase, which means the units become flipped to fresh, but not the HQ, so they still can't activate on their own. It's better to be fresh even without an HQ being fresh, because as a defender, if you are fresh, you get to roll a d10 no matter what. If you're spent, then you're going to roll a d6. So for this first turn, all of the UN units will be defending with a d6, which is obviously much worse than a d10. But next turn, they will defend normally with a d10 for the most part. They're basically, right? So that much, that's just going to be what, how things are going to shake out there. Um, next turn things will be back to normal, so the UN player will be able to spend supply, refresh their HQs, but because they're going to have to spend to refresh any and all HQs they want to use, it's still going to be a disadvantage for them. So for the next several turns, honestly, the UN will be at a fairly tremendous disadvantage. One thing I forgot to mention in between these clips, the cuts, is that the UN sort of knew that and so decided to spend out some of its. Maybe I should have spent all of it, honestly, but well, maybe that's the mistake I've made, is that I should have spent more. Really, if we're not, so basically my point is I put some more prepared position markers down to try to create something of a line. And as I'm looking at it, I'm realizing, I'm like, okay, I spent 4 supply doing that, but is there any reason for me not to spend the rest of my supply doing that right now? Because I'm not going to be able to activate anybody. So that would effectively mean I get 8 more that I could place, or 4 trenches. That might be, most of the counters I have. Yeah, I actually can do that. Maybe I need to do that for myself, right? And spend out all of my supply and create some more prepared positions. So maybe this is a correction I'll make for myself. and that I am choosing to spend the rest of the UN supply because we knew we weren't going to get any more, basically. Um, that helps us a lot in terms of defending where we need to defend. It's a lot of prepared positions. Oops. Yeah, he's already got one. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so nearly nearly all the hexes that really matter for defending have prepared position markers. I'd have to spend more for trenches, but that would mean fewer hexes covered. Um, but I think this should be sufficient to try, right? This actually is probably one of the few times it makes total sense to try to have these prepared position trench markers where we have nothing else to spend that supply on. We have no choice because we're going to have to replenish our supply before we can flip our HQs again, right? We can't refresh them through the rest of this turn or the next turn. Might as well spend all the supply we had to begin with creating these markers. That's like it in some ways that kind of doesn't make sense, right? Or seems unfair. I know the Chinese are coming, which was not really the case historically. So I'm going to create a bunch of these defensive position markers. I'm not sure how well I like that or how it squares, but I'm able to do it, and so I am doing it. There you go, guys. Bam. Um, so I'm not going to record each and every movement in combat that's going to happen here, but let me give you some cliff notes before we even get started. The communist player does have access to tanks and artillery, but no air. The allies can still get support, assuming the defending unit is in a line of communication. It can get tank, artillery, and the air support, even though there's not much air support due to the weather. The allies still have all of that. The UN player still gets all of that. They'll get the benefit of the prepared position markers in many cases, which will nullify most of the support that the communist Chinese would try to have. So most of this is going to come down to a very likely D10 die roll on the communist side, right? They're going to pick their combat shit out of 3. They're going to draw 3. They're going to pick one. They're very likely just going to generally have a D10. They're going to get bonuses for supported attacks, and where possible, their aid, their support from artillery and tank, but not much. Versus a D6 for all of these UN forces, with where it's feasible, artillery and tank, but also air, and potentially some support as well, because you have enough guys nearby one another usually that they can also support and add a modifier. And the one trick is going to be whoever loses that fight, if they lose badly, might be forced into a position where like the only way they can take steps is to eliminate units, and that could be very gnarly very quickly. So will the D10 to D6 difference be enough for the UN or for the communists to surmount the UN? And is the Allied air support going to be able to make up the difference between that D6 and the D10? I think it's going to be really close a lot of the time, and the die rolls will probably actually come out to be pretty close to one another as we go. But again, I'm not. This video is going to be very long already because we've talked about Chinese intervention so much. I'm not going to bother to record each and every combat. So when we come back, you guys will see the net results of things. And it could be gnarly, it could be, who knows? Oh boy, what a weird series of activations. Um, so what happened? Well, a lot happened. We had a lot of goofy stuff going on. We actually even had a case where I got a equal result, and we had a roll a random event, which wasn't too interesting. Um, Weirdly enough, over here we had forced a routed UN unit, but we actually lost an entire communist unit because the die rolls just went way out there on the edges. And rather than take a bunch of other point losses, I figured I could sacrifice one Chinese unit, which I did over here. I could not quite get I couldn't quite get through over here. I actually had to retreat just to save face a little bit, so things got goofy. But along the line elsewhere, we put some hurt on the UN forces. Here we actually achieved a breakthrough. So it was basically the UN player had to get rid of units. They didn't want to give up much else. They thought about giving up victory points, but they're so close to victory if they can just hold out a little bit longer. But over here you can see we were starting to push through. And I think somewhere along the way the UN did give up a victory point. They really didn't want to, but the road to Pyongyang is starting to open up. Elsewhere, it's congested. There's not as much going on, but we did cause several routes of UN forces. We were getting awfully close to possibly being able to cut these guys out of communication, but can't. I don't. Well, maybe we did. I'm trying to see. No, I guess maybe we didn't. We did not cut them out of supply. It's kind of hairy over here, but we're projecting Zox through. The UN forces are going to have a hard time. We might trap, actually, a bunch of units, and they might need a sea evacuation or something out of the port that's right there. But we're definitely putting the hurt on the UN forces. They've lost some of the hexes that they spent supply to build prepared positions on. They're still holding a few more. I chose my attacks as well as I could. Um, but we have actually made some progress chipping away because of the routing. Um, we chipped away at some of the UN artillery, which, the weird thing with those prepared markers is that, like, you can't really use tank support even as the defender. So you're really stuck using air and artillery, which is UN advantaged, but um, I don't know. It was kind of interesting, and the die rolls were close some of the time, which led to, like I said, some bad things for the communists down here. But everywhere else, they did pretty good, where they were chipping away at the UN replacements a little bit. The UN artillery level has actually dropped due to those routes. A lot of the snafu pools ended up not affecting the UN player very much. Um, but I'd say it was pretty good for the communists. There was a couple of combats the communists actually lost by like a point, so they shaved off a couple of replacement points in a couple of combats. But overall it was pretty good. Now I think what the communists are going to have a hard time achieving now is that when the UN player gets to refresh next turn, they're going to defend with a D10, and the sort of margin they were getting to put the hurt on the UN is going to kind of go away. So it's going to be really important. This is absolutely the only way that we're going to make progress as the Chinese is to make use of the breakthrough and get to where we have 3 to 4 units attacking one hex. That's really where the communists were guaranteed to eliminate a unit, because they were doing deliberate attacks. We're getting like a plus 12 because you double the support bonus, and that just outpaced everything the UN could put into that combat, and they were able to eliminate a few US units. There's actually now 3 US units in the replacement pile for the UN player. We completely eliminated 3 US units. And I think it's going to be harder to get those guys back on the board. So that much is a goodness for the communists. So I can't say this was like ultimate breakthrough action this turn, but the communists definitely, achieved some gains here. But as I go to I didn't do the the communist refresh phase. I'll do that later. I'm running out of time to record right now, unfortunately, for today. So we're only going to do one turn this turn because of the Chinese intervention. Chinese intervention. Um, but here's the thing: we got to the end of the turn, and what happened? Well, the communists put another objective marker in Pyongyang. They'd rather have a lot of objectives in one place that they can reveal all at once and then start getting points for. But in the meantime, the UN player is getting victory points. So they pulled off a 3-pointer and they're sitting at 15. That might mean that the Soviets can intervene, um, but we're still awfully close to being able to win as the UN player right now. So even with this, it's if you're playing for time, the UN is still sitting pretty good. They just need to do damage control, and they've got these guys that can try to cover. They were sort of just a holding force because it's hard to move through these mountains and get supplies, the communists. Now we're going to need them to just try to plug some of the hole. But again, they won't be able to activate until next month. So there you go. I think I'm going to end the video here. Like I said, we're just going to get through the one turn. I don't like ending a video midway through a month. But this Chinese intervention turn, just a lot is going on. And it took me actually a really long time to play through this activity phase. It must be getting close to maybe an hour of me just kind of figuring out what attacks I could do and wanted to do and what made sense. And so, yeah, there you go. That's what we're gonna try. We're gonna see what happens. Yeah, this poor communist down here got routed. He got kicked back pretty bad. That was a bad time. Um, but yeah, there you go. Okay, guys, I will see you hopefully in the next one, and we'll keep on through the winter here. Now the real show has gotten underway, but the UN is sitting in somewhat of an advantaged position. Thanks for watching, guys. Appreciate it. See you in the next one. Take care. Keep gaming.